Well, I'm back, after being gone from being back from being gone the last time. This time I have an excuse for being back, because it's the start of a new year, or at least it was when I started working on this video. And today's video is going to be a little different than what I normally do. New year, new video, new topic. I'm getting into comics. Not just any comics though. Today I'm reviewing the Rippaverse comics, as they stand right now as of 2024. Isom 1, 2, and Alphacore number 1. There will be more in the future that I'll get to when enough new ones are out, but as of the time of writing, those are the 3 comic books that are available. And I do mean books, because each one of these is about 100 pages. I'm not super familiar with the backstory surrounding these comics, or comics in general for that matter. I'll be very upfront and say that I don't typically read comics, or manga for that matter. I read Berserk and a few others, but I've not read much in the way of Western comics. I am sort of familiar with them through osmosis. One of the reasons for that is simple. They are very difficult to get into, but I'm in luck with these Isom comics. They're very new, they're seemingly pretty popular, and they're coming out pretty regularly, so I thought I'd throw my hat in and see what all the fuss is about. I will be spoiling the plot, so if you want to read them, you've been warned. Spoiler alert. Anyways, getting right into it. Starting with Isom number 1, we have Avery Silman, our protagonist who lives on a ranch just outside of the town of Florespark. His hero name being Isom. I'm not sure what Isom means exactly, but I'm assuming it's related to his secret identity as a superhero. I will note that I'm not exactly sure if that is a secret identity. The secret identity thing itself is for sure a trope from typical comic book heroes, but I don't know if that's necessarily the case here. But I'll talk more about that later. Our story begins when Avery gets a call from his sister Altona that a mutual friend's daughter, Jasmine, from their church has gone missing, and she asks him to investigate. He's at first apprehensive, but eventually agrees. Altona tells him that she might be in trouble because she was spotted with Avery's old friend Darren, who's known for owning a shady club called Merc? Not sure how to pronounce that. Avery eventually agrees to go look for her, and he heads down to the club. On the way off his ranch, Avery tells his friend and co-worker Sam to take care of some of the orders they have for customers on the ranch. Without breaking every single plot point down beat by beat, Avery goes to the club, meets Darren, is offered a job working the kitchen, and then basically gets told to get lost by Darren when he inquires about Jasmine. This leads into one of the main themes I think of this book, which is respect. This disrespect angers Avery, and we'll learn that he kinda has a short temper. Darren has hired thugs that attempt to beat Avery up and remove him from Merc. I'm going to start calling it Merc. But Avery has special abilities of some sort and easily overpowers them all, at least until Darren's own superpowered thug shows up. This is where the plot got interesting for me. The comic describes superpowered beings as something called an accept. Avery and this other accept go for a few rounds, and Avery actually loses and gets thrown out. He gets thrown out right as another accept is fighting the police and Alphacore. A lot more on them later. She then starts fighting him thinking he's part of the police, and then grabs him, flies in the air, and chucks him. As we learn, Avery can't fly, and he lands on a car and then goes into a coma. Now, normally losing 2 fights in a row as an introduction to a character would make me think that they're kinda weak. But this story manages to throw a wrench into that perception just a little bit. He is bested, yes, but he's not necessarily defeated. He very quickly wakes up from his coma and escapes the hospital still wearing his hospital gown and resumes the search for Jasmine, not having received any answers from his visit with Darren earlier. This got me curious to the nature of Avery's powers. In his talk with Darren earlier that I glossed over, he mentioned that Avery, or Isom, was an average student in high school, and that he was not an exceptional, pardon the pun, athlete. Isom himself mentions as he's being thrown in the air by Yaira, the blonde villain from before, that he had to, quote, teach himself things people like him shouldn't be capable of. The doctors that revived him in the hospital also said that their tests did not indicate that he is an accept, just that they couldn't rule it out. Now, I can't say for certain if he is an accept, or if he's a Green Lantern type character that's just been bestowed with powers by some device, because there's not enough content to determine that yet. But I will go on a tangent and say that I think that it would be far more interesting if that was the case. Avery mentioned having to teach himself stuff, so I'm inclined to believe that he is not naturally gifted with any sort of powers. And the powers we have seen him display in Isom 1 and Isom 2, sorry for jumping ahead a little bit, are mostly enhanced healing. He seems strong, but not like Superman or even Spider-Man levels of strong, at least so far. I am more drawn towards characters that have to struggle to gain strength. A Kuwabara type will always be more interesting to me than a Superman or a Spider-Man who is simply powerful by circumstance beyond their control. Now, I'm not saying that Isom Isom is a Kuwabara type, at least not yet, and there are very few characters that can really be properly compared to Kuwabara. But what I am saying is, I like the skeleton of what I see so far. The arc that begins Isom is called Ill-Advised, and that is the rationale for most of his actions. He's pursuing Jasmine's whereabouts at this point by his own admission, mainly because he was disrespected by Darren in the club. And going back to my Kuwabara theory, that sort of tracks. He is a self-made man that lives on the ranch with a business he built himself with employees, and as Darren said, Avery was not gifted athletically or academically. It's not like these things came easily to Avery, so it makes sense he would be prideful over being spoken down to and offered a menial labor job as though it was winning the lottery. I'm not justifying Avery's actions so much as rationalizing them, because as we'll find out, that was ill-advised. Avery returns to the club and actually finds Jasmine, but is soon separated from her when Darren's goons come between them. The implication is that Jasmine is here against her will in some way. He has a rematch with the Accept that threw him out earlier the same day, but this time Avery is victorious. The win does feel a bit more earned since we saw him lose twice in a row, but it does come with a cost like I mentioned earlier. Darren and Avery are old and very estranged friends from high school, and so naturally Darren knows Avery's family and will begin to target them. Avery fears this inevitability and warns his sister to stay armed when she goes to work. She works for some group called Projexis, and I will cut the comic book some slack. There is a lot more going on now than the simple kidnap Jasmine plot. This is issue number 1, and they're trying to establish a universe, so they're trying to set up a lot of things without just doing massive exposition dumps. I appreciate that, but anyways, apparently Projexis is a big deal, and she's not worried about them trying something at her job. The story of issue number 1 wraps up as Avery returns to the place he got his super suit and asks for it back. There's an entire operation to suit making in this world, and the costumes are more than just outfits. They actually have some function. Isom asks for his suit to be modified to absorb fall damage to compensate for his lack of flight. And that wraps up Isom number 1. I'm not covering every single little thing that happened because there's a lot I glossed over in that first issue. But I will say that I did enjoy Isom number 1. Avery is flawed and impulsive, but he's not overpowered, and at least his actions do seem to have some sort of consequence with Darren now targeting his family. I wouldn't like it if our main character was this dumb hothead that was never punished for it. He seems to be acting as our guide to this new universe, so a lot of weight is on his shoulders. But like I said, there wasn't too much in the way of exposition dumps, which is good. But simultaneously, there's a lot that we still don't know about this universe. It feels as though the story itself is pulling the reader in many different directions. But like I said, this is the first issue, so I can forgive a bit because this issue is doing the legwork of also trying to set up a universe while telling the story. I did notice this, and I think it's really interesting. It's a sort of code of ethics that appears in each one of these comics in either the very front or the very back of the book, particularly about canon and continuity. The line about there being no multiverse stuck out to me, and I really hope this remains true. This is a side note, but I've gotten so sick of multiverse stuff. At first it was sort of quaint, but now it's become a weird trope that's everywhere. From Dragon Ball Z, to Invincible, to Marvel and DC, and Mortal Kombat. Arguably even Shrek did it. Enough with this multiverse stuff. I'm not saying that's always bad, but I am saying that I'm tired of seeing it. So it's refreshing seeing it called out as lazy, especially when it's used to replace a character that's been killed off. One of the comics I did read and enjoy were the Injustice comics, and as much as I like those comics, it was very lazy to use the multiverse to resolve the plot of who's going to stop Superman, and it was lazy to use it to bring back dead characters. If a character's death can be undone by essentially bringing in a clone with all the same memories, then their initial death had no meaning and was just a cheap prop to elicit an emotional response. The other point of this blurb that I like was the bit about keeping reboots to a minimum, because like I said earlier, years on, it does make keeping up with this stuff difficult as a newbie. I never really understood why comic books do this. Characters and stories should grow and mature, and invariably end and die too. Superman and Batman were written in like the 30s. I would be totally okay with the characters eventually just retiring or dying and having new characters spring up to replace them as time goes on and their universe continues. I guess I shouldn't say that I don't understand why they keep the characters going. They're recognizable and marketable, but the cost of keeping these characters forever is to instead kill the entire universes they built every 10 to 20 years or so and redo everything and everyone with slight variations. In a way, that was the birth of the multiverse concept in comics. It's refreshing to see these orthodoxies called out plainly. Moving on to Isom number 2, we continue with Avery explaining why he returned the suit in the first place. There's a flashback to years ago. A burnt up and destroyed office complex with two people wearing superhero outfits hiding in the wreckage. These two people are not actually superheroes though, and were just at a costume party of some sort. They're cowering and hiding from some sort of monster that caused all this carnage. Avery shows up and lifts the desk they were hiding under and tells them that it's going to be safe. Moments later though, the monster that did all this reappears. Avery tells them to run away and begins trying to fight the monster. But much like in Isom number 1, Avery is unable to defeat this enemy and one of the civilians is killed by it. The guilt of this failure caused him to retire and return the suit. The suit maker named Cedric tells Avery that him not being a hero the last few years probably caused a lot of people to die and that he should be happy that he was able to save at least one person on that day. Avery goes back to his house to sleep because the poor dude hasn't slept in a couple days, not counting the brief coma he was in. Upon returning, he discovers that Sam left the security house at the ranch open. When Avery goes to investigate, he sees these weird, bipedal, furry, demon-looking creatures. They stab Avery in the shoulder with their claws and burn him before burning the entire building and vanishing. The fire gets the attention of Avery's other farmhands who hurry over to help. This is probably my favorite part of Isom 2. Avery's farmhands inform him that they already called something called gooding, because the fire department would take too long to get way out here in the countryside. Moments later, drones show up and begin dousing the fire. Then a man shortly after also appears. This is Gooding. He's a sort of fireman slash private investigator slash first responder slash private militia that you pay a subscription to when he shows up to help in a variety of situations. In a world with superpowered people, someone like Gooding seems more realistic to me than Superman or Batman. This guy is a hero for hire essentially, and his response time is pretty good. If I lived in that universe, I'd probably also subscribe. And look at that, affordable too, starting at $50 a month. Anyways, Gooding tends to Avery's injuries and tells him that he might have some theories about what these creatures are. And luckily for Avery, his payment package includes a free hypothesis from Gooding. Avery finally decides to try and get some sleep because he hasn't slept since Isom number 1 when he was in that coma. But on his eternal quest to get sleep, he's interrupted yet again when his sister Altona calls him. I skipped over this part at the beginning of Isom number 2, but I'll mention it now in context. Avery's sister Altona was jumped by Darren and his men in her office at Projexis, but it becomes clear why she said before that she wasn't worried about being attacked at her job. Because right after Darren attacks her, an armed brigade of people jump in to save her from Darren, led by her manager, Lincoln. Lincoln roughs up Darren a bit, and then his armed guards escort him and the rest off the premises. He then offers to protect Altona and her daughter, who is at the Projexis campus. Now, I said before that I didn't like exposition dumps, but I will note that I still do not know what Projexis is exactly. They have military-style guards, and they also have a campus that Altona's daughter attends school at. Now, maybe that campus is a public school, and Projexis is some megacorp that owns a lot of stuff, or maybe that campus is completely private for children of employees. Either way, I'm not really sure what it is exactly that they do. In this case, a bit more exposition would be nice, at least if Projexis is going to factor into the story more going forward. Altona explains what happened to Avery and that she's alright but was a bit roughed up. She's on speaker with Avery and Lincoln asks Avery to come by the office so Projexis can protect him and come up with a plan of action for them all. This lends credence to the secret superhero identity that I mentioned at the very beginning of this review. Lincoln and Projexis must not be aware that Avery is Isom, or that he has some minor powers of his own. Avery doesn't answer Lincoln and hangs up in anger, declaring that he's going to kill Darren. Back at Projexis, Lincoln works to flush out the moles that allowed Darren to breach security in Projexis in the first place. He is seen getting into a car with his assistant Jason when they meet this blonde woman in the parking lot who he calls Sally. She's dressed in formal business attire and has been hired on as some sort of consultant. She leaves after a brief hello, wanting to get back to her work, but ominously she has a very devilish smile as she leaves. She looked a lot like Yaira, the blonde villain that threw Avery into the car that put him in a coma in Isom number 1. I'm interested to see what the deal is with Yaira. She seems to have her own agenda and machinations from fighting with Alphacore and working with Projexis under a different name. It seems likely that she's going to be a significant character in the future. As Lincoln and Jason are driving down the road, they are preyed upon by a group sent by Darren. The neighboring car begins shooting at them. Fortunately, the windows of the car are bulletproof, much to Lincoln's assistant's surprise. Jason's surprise is all the confirmation Lincoln needs to know that he was one of the moles that allowed Darren and his crew into Projexis. Lincoln deactivates the windshield protections, removes his seatbelt, and wrestles with Jason over control of the steering wheel, and rams the two of them into a roadblock. This sends Lincoln flying out the front windshield, presumably according to his plan? We then cut back to Avery, who's back at his house after having hung up on Altona and Lincoln, declaring his intent to kill Darren. We see him arm himself with a gun, a couple magazines, and a cool pair of shades. Because if there's one thing you need when you're going to go out and kill someone in revenge, It's cool sunglasses. But as he's leaving his house, he runs into a woman who is about to knock on his front door. It's his worker Sam's wife. Sam was not seen ever again after those demons burnt his warehouse and stabbed him in the shoulder. She's completely unaware of any attack or fire though. All she knows is he never came home last night and that he's not answering his phone. Avery tells her not to worry and to come with him to Gooding's place so they can find out about that. This is kind of the point I confirm my suspicions that Avery is just very, very impulsive and aimless. He just sort of wanders from one situation to the next. Now in this case, this might be for the better, because just moments before he spoke to Sam's wife, I'm pretty sure he was going to kill Darren. Darren probably has it coming, but this is still reckless and kinda dumb. Last time Avery went to see Darren, he got beat up twice and ended up in a coma. A very short coma, but it still also ended with Darren targeting Avery's family to begin with. There are super police in this world, Alphacore, that he could call on, but those plans are interrupted because he's going to go try and figure out what happened to Sam, presumably just because she knocked on the door. Like I said, his lack of planning in this case is probably for the better, in this case because his friend Sam is missing and he probably does need help, whereas going after Darren is probably just going to make things worse. Still, had Sam's wife not been at the door right when Avery was leaving, I can't help but feel that the story would be going in a completely different direction right now. Anyways, Avery and Sam's wife drive out to Gooding's estate when they're stopped by robots at the front gate. They're informed by the robots that they're expected to step out of their vehicles. The robot deploy these wide platforms from their sides and asks them to step aboard, and they fly towards Gooding's house. When they arrive, Avery explains how beasts attacked them, set the building on fire, and that Sam was nowhere to be found. This puts Sam's wife into a panic and she faints. Kind of a dick move of Avery to not tell her about any of this until they got to Gooding's house. She hasn't seen or heard from her husband since yesterday. Were they just driving together in that car in total silence on the way to Gooding's house? I guess it must not be too long of a drive since Gooding had an amazingly quick response time to put out the fire earlier in the day. Gooding at least calls Avery out on breaking the news to her like that, to which he says that Sam said that she was always dramatic, which I mean, I guess, sure, but still kinda not nice. Gooding has one of his robots take her to the medical wing. Gooding begins to explain that the DNA from those monsters doesn't match anything in his database, and his database is very extensive. He further speculates that these monsters likely came from some place called the Underneath. Gooding goes on to explain that some creatures like this appeared during, quote, the War of Separation. Apparently there was some sort of war and Texas won with a guy named Brian being the hero. I can only really speculate as to what any of this means exactly, but apparently when Avery was a child there was some sort of war of separation, like a civil war, and demons appeared in the chaos. I'm really interested to see how this mythos expands as the comic goes forward. And I do like that not everything is being presented here on a silver platter. Gooding explains that he'll need a few more days to research this, to which Avery responds that they don't have that kind of time. Gooding tells Avery to go to this person who lives about an hour out west then, who might have more answers now. I thought that this was kind of funny. Avery is getting mad about not having any time to waste, and so Gooding's like, okay, then go see this person, to which Avery is like, why am I paying you? He agrees to go out and see this mysterious person out west, but then when he gets back home, Avery's thought bubble says that he figures he can afford to rest for a day or two. I remember reading that and thinking, wait, weren't you just getting mad at Gooding for saying he needs a few days to do research? But you know, it's dark now, and he has not slept since his coma. People keep lighting him on fire or calling him when he's about to sleep, so alright, go get some sleep. When Avery wakes up, his new costume is here, and according to the note, it's 1 pound heavier and is made from some special material that will enable him to endure falls from great heights. This is courtesy of the PTSD Yaira gave him the other day when she chucked him into the car. Also, Cedric notes that he gave his waistband some utility. With that, Avery gets in his truck and heads out west to meet this mysterious person Gooding mentioned. When he arrives, he sees a large castle and is greeted by large wolves, alligators in a moat, and large pterodactyl-like creatures. Very strange creatures to be here in Texas. They begin to become hostile and they start attacking him. He's fighting with them when the owner of these creatures appears, Sidney Bloodruth. He mentions Gooding and they begin talking about the creatures that stabbed him and burnt his warehouse down. I'm actually really curious how Bloodruth and Gooding know each other. I really doubt she subscribes to his home protection services with all of her weird creatures guarding her castle, but who knows. Maybe they go way back. She tells Avery that she specializes in these mythological type creatures, and they start talking about hell. And Avery mentions that there's only one hell, and she tells him that he's technically correct, but there are a lot of places that meet the description of hell, to which he asks, like, different universes? She says no, different universes are fictional nonsense. She meant different dimensions. Going back to what I was saying earlier about multiverses, I really hope this is further condemnation of the idea from the Rippaverse. Bloodruth goes on to explain that these creatures probably aren't from the hell, and that they likely got here the old-fashioned way, and furthermore that she has an idea from where. This is another moment where the ill-advised title might be coming into play, because Bloodruth says that she normally does research before running off, but with Isom here, she wants to investigate the cave she suspects that they're coming from. They fly off on their pterodactyl creature to the cave and quickly discover that it's completely overrun with these bipedal, furry creatures that stabbed Avery before. At this point, Bloodruth says that they should retreat, but Avery notes that these are the same creatures as before, so he'll not be leaving without Sam. She agrees to help him, and together they fight these creatures in the cave to look for Sam. Bloodruth, as her name implies, has some weird powers to shoot these fiery blood wave things. Eventually, Bloodruth finds Sam in a small cave surrounded by corpses. Sam says that they were all dead when he arrived. He has this weird glowing marks on his back. Sam and Bloodruth begin leaving when they see Avery becoming overwhelmed by these monsters. Bloodruth wants to just flee, but Sam says he's not leaving without Avery. That's a good employee. Avery tells him to run away as he fights with an overwhelming number of monsters. That's an even better boss. As Sam and Bloodruth make it to the exit, they become surrounded by these monsters. But then some of Bloodruth's large wolves and their pterodactyl show up and they begin defending them. The comic ends as they head for the exit atop the pterodactyl while Avery becomes overwhelmed with even more monsters. And that's it for Isom number 2. There is definitely a lot more going on in Isom number 2 than Isom number 1. A lot more action, and Isom himself gets a bit more characterization. I still think he's a bit impulsive, but he's not overpowered. Quite the opposite. He frequently finds himself out of his depth and completely outclassed by his enemies. The flashback that made him quit being a hero in the first place, for example, against Chadron. Isom number 2 also shows us a different side of this world than Isom number 1. Now we have these demon-like creatures and Chadron, who kind of reminds me of Apocalypse from DC. The Kuwabara comparison I drew a while ago might not be totally out of left field then. An impulsive and rash normal human who's not the spirit detective, fighting demons despite frequently being outclassed by them. That's both Kuwabara and Isom. But we'll see where the series goes if that comparison is warranted. Right now it's mainly a joke. But still, there's something to it. I don't think Isom is the biggest punk of Seriosky Junior High. I also really like Gooding and the concept of the hero for hire. I think that if superpowers were real, you probably would have people starting businesses like that, rather than being heroes out of the goodness of their hearts. Avery mentioned back in Isom number 1 that he couldn't focus on saving Jasmine because now his own family is being targeted. I wonder if the story is going to loop back to Jasmine, because as of now, his family is being protected by Projexis, and he saved his ranch worker Sam. Of course, that's assuming he gets out of this cave with the monsters without incident. He seems to kind of just drift from one problem to another, so maybe he'll get back to Jasmine. But as of right now, I have no idea what happened to her. Overall, I enjoyed Isom number 1 and number 2. The art and the colors are very nice looking, the action is very vibrant. Next, I'm going to be reviewing Alphacore number 1. Alphacore is the super police squad from Isom number 1 that was pursuing the blonde woman that threw Avery through the air. The story opens with the leader of Alphacore, Brian Solari, apprehending some bank robber that has a hostage. Right away I can see the contrast of Solari with Avery. For one, he can actually fly, but he seems more like a traditional superhero, especially in this panel. Solari can tank bullets pretty easily as well. He takes the bomb this robber had and chucks it in the air and throws him in a pool to safety. But Solari is a little too much of a traditional superhero. There are legal procedures in this world. You can't just be Clark Kent Superman and go stop the bad guy and fly off. As we learn, Alphacore is only allowed to involve themselves if there are accepts involved. Otherwise, it's a standard police matter. Everyone seems to know this, especially his fellow Alphacore member Ingrid Valdez, who he butts heads with a lot. She's more grounded and obstinate to Solari's idealism. As for the third member of Alphacore, there's Braxwell, who, if I had to sum up, is that guy at the office that shows up and gets his work done without any drama. He doesn't seem to have any baggage like Valdez, but he also doesn't go off on calls without authorization like Solari. Solari is later dressed down by his superior for going on a call without permission. We learned that he used to be a military guy and he became a cop because it was the closest thing he could do in private life to being a soldier. This puts him at odds with the public at times though, because Solari treats being a cop as though he's in a war. I can't really blame him for treating certain aspects of his job like a war. Alphacore flies around in a giant Avengers-style gunship. His overreach at the bank has certain public agitators in the media angry. We find out that the bank robber's bomb malfunctioned and it was actually supposed to go off inside the bank to destroy evidence. Evidence that these corrupt board members of some evil corporation wanted removed. There's a dynamic between these two. She wants to cover up their illegal actions covertly, and he's reckless and tried to use a bomb which drew a ton of attention to themselves, which inadvertently got Alphacore involved. This starts this little game of whack-a-mole with this evidence plotline. I'm going to explain this now briefly. So these two corrupt corporate people have evidence of something illegal they did in this bank that they need to get rid of. So they're going to have this bank robber unknowingly blow himself up to destroy evidence in the bank, but Solari is hyperactive and threw the bomb in the air before it could harm anyone. So now this bank robber is a liability for these two. So they get this lawyer who's a major Alphacore critic to represent that bank robber, and the electric accept that Braxwell just arrested. Then the lawyer acts as an agent for these two corporate people to make the electric accept assassinate the bank robber in jail by getting a charge from an officer's taser. The smarter of these two corporate people, Lillian, realizes that this lawyer is a link between the robber and the electric accept and potentially back to them, so she has an idea to get rid of him. This introduces us to who I think is probably the most dangerous villain so far in the Rippaverse, Benny. Benny is this fat guy in a Hawaiian t-shirt. He has mind control powers and can make people do whatever he wants just by asking them to. The people themselves don't seem to think anything was odd about either afterwards, which is even more ominous. So Lillian, the smart corporate executive, sends Benny to the bank to just ask for access to a safety deposit box. He then replaces the contents with something else that will be important later. Then, Benny finds the lawyer and tells him to jump out a window. Meanwhile, Michael, the dumber corporate executive, sends Billy Bob, an accept that has fire powers, who lives in a trailer with his grandma, to go to that same bank to go get the contents of that safety deposit box. Billy Bob shows up and torches the place to get into the safe, which naturally gets Alphacore called. Billy Bob actually gets the better of Solari in their fight, knocks him out, and gets into the safe. But a big weakness of his firepower is his need for oxygen. Once he gets into the safe, the teller just closes it behind him and locks him in. When Billy Bob tries to escape by burning his way out of the safe, he passes out from being in an enclosed space. Solari comes to outside, and with the help of the fire department, they douse Billy Bob and arrest him. With how the electric guy broke out from being tasered by someone who didn't know not to tase the electric type accept, I'm wondering how they imprison someone who's a fire type accept. I guess they could keep him in an enclosed area all the time so his fire powers would knock himself out again. That, or they could keep him somewhere wet. If I lived in this world, I would be a huge thin blue line Alphacore guy. You have people that can electrocute you, burn you, mind control you, and that's just what we've seen so far. I don't know if there's going to be a Tomura Shigaraki type character later on, but already the average person is really outgunned. And then there's Yaira from Isom #1, who seemingly held her own against all of Alphacore. If anything, that means there needs to be like 30 or 40 Alphacore people at least. There's probably an SCP-style prison somewhere in the Rippaverse for the more dangerous accepts. Maybe there'll be a comic about that in the future. It'll star some researcher that has to deal with these eldritch horrors. Anyways, Solari notices the safety deposit box that Billy Bob was trying to get into and decides to not follow regulation again by just illegally opening the safety deposit box himself and seeing what's inside. He finds the contents that Benny replaced earlier. The content is a simple rubber ducky attack, unbeknownst to Alphacore. Solari returns to the gunship, called the Eagle Nest, with the USB in hand. His tech people are very concerned about what could be on the USB, but before they can really say, hey, let's test this in an isolated test environment to see what's on it, Solari once again ignores procedure by just plugging the USB into the main computer on board their giant Avengers-style gunship. The rubber ducky attack is successful, and they lose control of the Eagle Nest and immediately begin descending towards the ground. I won't spoil every single plot point in this comic, just most of them, but suffice to say, I really like Alphacore. The world building here feels very organic, the characters are being given a chance to grow. I didn't even talk about Wilkins and Valdez much. I think what works in Alphacore's favor is seeing them have to go through the process of dealing with criminals. We get a more standardized look into the Rippaverse world than with Isom. Isom was all about Avery and his interactions with the world, but Alphacore is a sort of police procedural. There's a big finale, the plot circles back in the end, but each member goes off and does their own thing for a large part of it. This serves the characters well. Solari is this idealist who wants to be a hero, who thinks procedure just gets in the way, and is a little bit too gung-ho. Valdez is a newbie with something to prove. She's competent but doesn't want to be seen as a superhero. She views her powers and stats as an accept as a modifier to her being a police officer first and foremost. Wilkins is a cop and an accept, but doesn't view himself as being skilled enough to be a member of Alphacore, even though he clearly is. I won't go through the plot of Alphacore like I did the plot of Isom 1 and 2, because Alphacore #1 felt more complete to me. The ending of this reminded me of the ending to the first episode of the Superman the Animated Series show, with Superman confronting Lex Luthor. The ending sort of said, hey Lex, we're going to have a lot of interactions in the future, but this story here today is wrapped up, and to the viewers at home, I hope you'll tune in next week. I got that kind of vibe from the ending of Alphacore #1. The next issue of Alphacore could go anywhere, whereas I kind of have a vague idea where Isom #3 is going to go, because it's continuing continuing through the ill-advised story arc. I don't know if Alphacore is going to remain more episodic in the future, or if it's going to have arcs like Isom is, but I'm looking forward to it. I'd say Alphacore is pretty decent. It's harder to give Isom a rating right now because the story isn't complete. Though I will say Alphacore number 1 wrapped up the story nicely and gave me a good idea as to who the characters are in a shorter time and a smaller page count than Isom did. Still, it's too early to really make any sort of judgments on the overall quality of where I think it's going. Star Trek Next Generation notoriously had a rocky start, and Alphacore has shown me that there are stories in this universe to give future comics a chance going forward. I will say I think I'm a bigger fan of Alphacore than Isom, but how much of that is based on the fact that Alphacore is episodic and wrapped everything up in one issue, as opposed to Isom so far not being episodic and having a continuing story arc? I can't say. It's possible that Isom will wrap up the ill-advised story arc in Isom 3 and change my opinion as to which one is my favorite. But anyways, this video is too long to edit. That's the video. Hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, or throw me $2 on Patreon if you want. I'm going to try and start uploading more often. Life just gets really busy. Be sure to check out some of the other videos on the channel if you like this one.